Hello, thank you, Philippa, and thank you for that. Excellent. Well, I hope I can live up to your introduction. Right, so yes, hello, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about some of the environmental market products that we have at our disposal in Northern Australia, but I'm going to have a particular focus on the carbon market, which is the largest and most established environmental market, and I'm going to talk about their associated trends. But I will at the end wrap up with some of the issues that we do have in terms of trying to move into a more diversified market for other environmental products. So I'm going to speak, as Philippa said, from my experience of working with the CMI on co-benefit visibility. I'm also speaking on behalf of my experiences with Pollination Foundation on environmental market systems mapping, initiatives moving outside or beyond the carbon market, and my work on standards and benchmarking frameworks for carbon and co-benefits, as well as my PhD research into the health of the governance system. So my background is I worked in environmental markets since 2003 in Europe, mainly in the sort of CDM component. And I entered this space through the investment banking door to projects which included biofuels in India, landfills in Indonesia, and avoided deforestation in Borneo. And then came to Australia in 2009, working with RM Williams Ag Holdings, incorporating best practice land management and carbon pricing mechanisms under the CFI for natural regrowth in the rangelands. After the demise of the CFI in 2013, I went into a master's in natural resource management at JCU, but quickly transitioned into development practice masters, and then recognising that the carbon market did still have a very faint pulse, and that market-based instruments could have a role in the Great Barrier Reef issues with water quality, I undertook a PhD under Alan Dale at JCU and the Cairns Institute, and Ruth Wallace at CDU and the Northern Institute. For my PhD, I took a governance systems lens. I used the structural functional approach to break down structure and understand how well a governance system is functioning. Please don't anyone show Alan Dale this slide, because basically I'm going to say that governance systems analysis is a structural functional approach to governance systems analysis, and basically it's who's doing what and how well are they doing. And I will refer back to this a little bit towards the end as we look at the carbon market and who's doing what and how well they're doing. Now, first, could we look at where these markets started and what structures them? This is an excellent slide that Tim was going to start with, and I was just going to segue neatly into it, but I'm going to have to do a little bit of explaining, and it's a very complex slide, which I was hoping Tim was going to go through, but what I really want to pull out, and I hope you can see my cursor, is at the highest level, vision and objective setting comes from the overarching frameworks and conventions. And here we're particularly looking at the Climate Change Convention and the Biodiversity Convention. The strategic strategies which arise out of those conventions take place at the annual COP. And we've got climate change in Glasgow this year and biodiversity at Kunming in October. Operationalisation of that overarching vision actually comes through the protocols. In the climate change, we've got the Kyoto Protocol, which we all know very well, which went on to become the Doha Agreement. And then we have similarly protocols for biodiversity. And then we move into the actual mechanisms. And this is kind of the bit I was going to launch in from Tim's segue. And in the actual mechanisms that we have used, particularly from under the Kyoto Protocol, was very much the flexible mechanisms, finance mechanisms, which includes the clean development mechanism and the trading mechanisms. And then you will see over on the other side, where I've highlighted in red on the left, we've got biodiversity offsets. And the reason I bring this up, and the reason I was so glad Tim had this slide, is that the Australian environmental markets have been very much shaped by this international practice. And the CFI very much learnt from the CDM and best practice that was emerging from the voluntary markets. And then the biodiversity offset mechanisms in Australia is one of the largest markets outside the USA. What we haven't done is embrace international emissions trading, as I think we're probably all very aware. payment for ecosystem services, which is above that biodiversity offset mechanism. It's not a term I like very much. It's far too broad and it's used very loosely. And I think this is something we're going to see a real change around. We're now going into a much tighter world with the mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement being thrashed out, mechanisms for carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and Mark Carney's scaling the voluntary carbon market alongside an increasing role of corporate actions with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure. And we also should be aware that under the Convention for Biodiversity, Biological Diversity, there is the Coalition for Higher Ambition of 30 by 30, and that will be thrashed out in COP next week. Now, just taking a little, since we're looking at international structures that shape the carbon markets that we have today, just let's look at a little more depth so that we understand just what a compliant market is, because this is a very different animal to what we have in Australia. Under a compliant market, and we saw this in the UK and then in the EU ETS, the first thing to do is decide what's in the national scope, what's in and out of scope. Generally, stationary energy is in, transport is out, air travel and freight are out, heavy industry is in, waste and landfills are in. So once the land sectors have been established as to what's in and out, and I would say that agriculture is being dealt with very differently by each nation, but in generally is coming more in than out of scope as we move forward. Once those sectors have been determined, then it's a case of putting caps on it, a national cap on the emissions that can be generated. And really that's an analysis issue at a national scale to look at which sectors the reductions can be made most cost effectively and looking at those low-hanging fruit. And then it's a case of allocating allowances within each sector, drilling down to facility by facility. And if you look at the diagram on the left, then once you've got that allocation for each facility, then they can trade between facilities. And that is very much your compliant market, trading between facilities to make sure you achieve the emission reductions where they're most cost effective. And then there's the scope down here at number 4 to bring in external offsets that have been generated elsewhere to help offset those compliant emissions. If we look at the voluntary market, which often follows and shadows a compliant market, it lacks the compliant market structure. And the voluntary market is very much entered into by companies that want to gain advantage by learning by doing, particularly when they recognise that the government policy is signalling that the compliant market is on the horizon. In this case, in the voluntary market, the source of offsets does not come from trading between facilities and frequently comes from the voluntary market, which does include the CDM market that does enter into the voluntary market, but also credits from less regulated projects. And this became a problem in the early voluntary markets, early in the 2000s, where projects were being undertaken that lacked integrity, and then there was a backlash against carbon cowboys, and projects in developing countries weren't taking the right consent, etc. And there was a lack of transparency. So it really did give the carbon market quite a bad name. Sorry, I seem to have lost how to move my slides forward. So the response to this rather bit of a mess in the voluntary market was very much standards. And by 2008, there were about 20 standards being used. And the ones that I've got on my slide are the main ones by 2012. And the carbon standards on the left included validating the project design, making sure that you had science-based calculations. You were using scientifically verified allometrics for tree growth, for example, looking at verification of emissions reductions claimed through third-party auditing, and then registering those emission reductions so they couldn't be double counted, and making sure that they were retired once they were retired against the counterparty's emissions. On the right-hand side, we've got some of the co-benefit standards that have emerged, very much managed by Vera and Gold Standard. Social carbon has since dropped out. But the main thing was the identification of stakeholders, ensuring free, prior, informed consent, having grievance mechanisms to address social or equity issues. And then they incorporated environmental benefits as well in that co-benefit space on the right. So do no harm and making sure there was biodiversity monitoring, etc. And so that any biodiversity claims were genuine. Generally, 2 standards are needed, one for the carbon and one for the co-benefits. And the VCS and CCB is the largest by volume today and is the standard of choice for RED. Some combine two, such as Gold Standard and Plan Vivo, but they tend to be applied to niche products, have lower volume but a higher price. Just thinking through today's prices internationally, the VCS is on its own is about $2 US dollars. VCS plus CCB $3.6, Gold Standard up to $6, and Plan Vivo $8. Those are average prices. Obviously, niche products that really tick all the right boxes can go much, much higher, whereas your Indian wind farm will probably be going about $2 or less. If you compare that with the compliant carbon offsets in the EU ETS, they went for the current price was €61 on the 31st of August. So you can see what a difference regulations make. Australia moved into this space in 2010. It is the only sovereign-backed carbon standard, which it stands out. It took the best of the international markets. It incorporated everything that was good about the CDM and the voluntary. It incorporated additionality and leakage, etc., permanence. It had integrity at the heart. It had good science, good policy, and good targets. They had the Emission Reduction Assurance Committee, which it certainly ensured integrity, but it did slow things down. They decided not to import methods, which would have got things up and running a lot quicker. And there was, we have decided to legislate methods, which again slows things down because the methods actually go into legislation. There's a land sector focus, which is another thing that differentiates Australia. We have vast degraded landscapes, and we do have scope for emissions reductions at scale, and we have a large agricultural base as well. Because of the land sector focus, we have environmental, social, cultural and economic co-benefits, but we don't have a national co-benefit standard at the moment. The policy certainly appeared to include one. There's spaces in the legislation for one, but as we all know, the process got interrupted. So looking at today's carbon markets in Australia, when I was undertaking my PhD, the most important thing was to determine the main carbon market domains, part of that structural component, and then to look at how well they were doing, that functional component. If we take the first at the highest level, it did tend to be very sort of scale-based and hierarchical, though it wasn't necessarily what I anticipated finding, but it was pretty obvious afterwards. If we look at the international component with Article 6, it deals with market mechanisms of the Paris Agreement, which can be quite thorny and quite complex, double counting, etc. The Sustainable Development Mechanism in Article 6 builds on Kyoto's flexibility mechanism, so we're really inheriting what we learnt from Kyoto, but actually with a fundamental shift from finance to sustainable development at the focus. Nationally, it's a rather sad domain. Our NDC is woefully low. We've got a lack of assessment on how to reach the targets, and we're relying very much on creative accounting. The states are a different story, a story often lost in our international standing. The states taking a contrary view, targeting net zero by 2050, particularly Queensland with the Land Restoration Fund as a leader. And the Land Restoration Fund has been a game changer in carbon farming in Queensland in particular, but generally. Operationalising the carbon market is the Emissions Reduction Fund, with the Clean Energy Regulator as the driver of supply and developer of methods, running the auctions and controlling the price, and managing Australia's very thin compliant component through the safeguard mechanism, which feeds down into the next domain, the supply domain, which the supply-demand dynamic is a result. It's very entangled because it's all fed from the Clean Energy Regulator. The voluntary market hasn't emerged in Australia, as there's no policy drivers at the compliant. Prices are the lowest cost of abatement, i.e. virtually at cost. Methods are slow and complex, but do have good science and integrity, but they become political. And at the project level, better business cases are needed, better recognition and understanding of the co-benefits, which might lead to a better price and a better aggregation models and value chain add. Just briefly, there's a lot of energy in the space in Queensland, an increasing focus in soil energy as part of the government's technology focus, with stretch targets of $3 monitoring costs per hectare. And we've got the Mate and Livestock Australia carbon neutral goal. We've got the Department of DOR with their Carbon Plus biodiversity certifications and standard discussion. So a lot of energy in the space. Government auctions, we've just had the 12th Emission Reduction Fund auction. As I say, they are the biggest buyers at the moment. That took place in April this year. They committed to purchase 6.8 million tonnes of abatement on behalf of the Commonwealth with an average price of $16. There were only 10 contracts awarded for 10 projects. We've got dwindling contracts. The price is increasing slowly. The Clean Energy Regulator would claim this is because the voluntary market and over-the-counter trades are increasing, but it's really hard to know. We've got a lack of transparency in the market generally. It's a seller's market at the moment, but it's very hard to know what the trades are and what's happening. A little indication, the voluntary market spot price has crept up to $22, as you can see there. Savannah burning, sort of the industry's worst kept secret, is selling at about $25 a tonne. So prices are up. They are working their way steadily up, but volume is low. So reflecting on Australia 10 years later, it's a messy merging of voluntary and compliant markets. As I say, we've got the taxpayer as the main purchaser, such that, you know, the beneficiary pays, not the polluter, so it's not good policy. The Clean Energy Regulator wears three hats. It's the purchaser, the regulator, and drives and controls supply. We're paying for the lowest cost of abatement, which means we're sort of relatively expensive carbon on the global market, but we're very cheap compliant. We're sort of hybrid. The government's not paying for co-benefits, which are considerable in the land sector, but the Land Restoration Fund is. Ideologically, the government is against any market-based mechanisms, which means we are sort of not entering into negotiations on a global scale for the export of our credits. We've got no sectoral analysis of how to reach our weak targets. Our compliant market is weak to non-existent, but the safeguard mechanisms has very flexible baselines. But that is under review this week, which will be interesting to see where that moves in the next couple of years. And the voluntary market, the government scheme for climate neutrality, is climate active, and it's pushing that hard, trying to drive up demand and take some of the onus off of the government. In Queensland, as I say, the Land Restoration Fund is a game changer. They are paying for co-benefits, which is very exciting, and we're seeing some movement there. They've spent a lot of time put a lot of time and money into learning by doing, and it's very exciting space, I think. Other innovative products, we've got South Pole's Eco Australia credits, which are stapling a biodiversity unit manufactured in Australia with a verified international carbon credit, gold standard, typically a cheap carbon credit with an expensive biodiversity unit to create an Eco Australia credit. The advantage of this is piggybacking off the carbon market, but with a really good biodiversity outcome. And we've also seen the reef credit scheme emerge in the last couple of years, which is very exciting. It's obviously at the stage right now where we can't really know what the market volume is. Supply is obviously very short. There's a big demand for it, which is very exciting. Going back to your question at the beginning, Philippa, about the issues of additionality, what they did was really took the community on the journey with them. So they had the cane growers and the NRM and the community, and they really looked into issues of grandfathering in the adopters and not rewarding the laggards. And they developed their methods with a good science panel. So they really did do best practice. Co-benefit standards are emerging in Australia. Revisiting standards, the international ones don't fit very well in Australia because we do have a lot of integrity. So a lot of the things that are mopped up on international standards don't need mopping up here. What we have seen emerge in the last year is the LRF co-benefit standard, which is very exciting, a very good umbrella standard, which incorporates accounting for nature and the core benefit verification framework, both of which can stand alone, but both of which can also slot into the LRF co-benefit standard.
5 more minutes, Rebecca.
Oh, that long? Okay. I'm nearly done. 2 more slides. Thank you. What I like about the LRF is it's brought in the flexibility for proponents and third parties to give assurance for the co-benefits. So that does mean the landowner can do it at their own assurance, for some particular methods, which I like. They've got the ability to pull in those third-party assurance of accounting for nature and the core benefit verification framework for those that want a greater level of assurance. And in their First Nations component, there's also, they will accept other evidence such as healthy country plans. So I like where the LRF is going. I think it's an exciting space. In terms of demand side trends, we're definitely seeing the need for scale, particularly internationally with the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Markets. We have got increased pressure from shareholders for scrutiny on those co-benefits and the carbon, of course. Looking for integrity and transparency, but there's a variety for buyers. Some will be happy with in-house due diligence, others want brokers due diligence, some just would like a very nice story that they know is credible, others want ESD and SDGs verified. So a very diverse market out there. Co-benefits important to the social license in many cases, but often buyers are buying a lot of cheap international credits and then just 5 to 20% of Australian ACCUs. There's a move against emissions avoidance to sequestrated carbon, particularly from Microsoft. And there is a reluctance to pay ACCU prices at scale, which is reasonably understandable. Beyond carbon, I did mention that we've done some environmental market system mapping, and I think perhaps this is something that may come up very much today. There is a gap in vision, a unifying statement for biodiversity type markets. There's lack of an overarching strategy or roadmap. There's lack of coordination between initiatives, and in the conservation and indigenous sector development lags behind the ag sector. Very little in the marine component, and a lack of aggregation of models to achieve scale. And we have got a series of barriers. We haven't got a cap like we do have, or any agreed targets like we do in the carbon market. We don't have a standard unit of measure like we do in the carbon market. I think impact of subsidies goes across the board in all the markets. Demand side, lack of clarity around investments and what they want out of it. And on the supply side, lack of understanding of what the potential might be, and additionality. Market trends and discussions, I just throw this out. We're seeing an increased visibility of co-benefits by the Clean Energy Regulator, which is a positive. In the land sector, not necessarily receptive to certification, but we do see carbon still as a carrier. When will we get those standalone markets? The LRF umbrella standards and umbrella, I said I'd really liked, but would UNCEA be an alternative umbrella? And I think someone's talking about that later today. And within supply chains, we're seeing that sort of approach on behavioural economics. Actually, how do we clean our products up? Should we really be asking the consumer to do that? And I think we need innovation, and I'm happy to talk about any ideas for fish credits, should anyone ask. Okay, thank you.